Right, so very good morning to everyone, and welcome to the first SDx Summit here in Palo Alto in beautiful California. My name is Vishal Sharma. I run a company called Inc., which focuses on providing expertise to companies in the telecom ecosystem, typically helping with next generation design architecture of systems and networks. So we're going to be talking about, the whole summit is called the SDx Summit, and I guess we're all here to discuss something called SDx, and we should probably be exploring a little bit more about what SDx really is all about. And you know, SDx, literally speaking, is the kitchen sink and everything to everyone today. But what does it mean for the purposes of this conference, or for the purpose of this discussion today? We'll find out more as we go throughout today and the summit evolves. But let me set things in context just so that there's a level setting. So over the last few years, software-defined concepts have been applied to the basic elements of infrastructure, network, storage, and compute. And then we've had the evolution of the terms software-defined storage, software-defined networks, and then software-defined compute. And that eventually came together in the concept of the software-defined data center, which was initially coined by the likes of VMware. But the basic idea there was that let's take the traditional silos that existed in the traditional data center in terms of the infrastructure of networks, systems, operating systems, storage resources and compute resources, and break them down to create a common pool of network compute and storage, which can then be parceled out under software control on an as-needed basis in a dynamic way. So that was sort of the whole concept, which led to the idea that every infrastructure element was recast as a software service, and that software service was callable by using dynamic software capabilities that were managing that infrastructure. And as a result of this, now the entire data center infrastructure could be configured based on the needs of the workloads and the applications that the enterprise was looking for. And you could avoid stranded capacity in any of these three domains, network, storage, and compute. You could use it more effectively from the data center operator's point of view, and you could offer services more cheaply from the enterprise's point of view. But at the same time, another development was happening, and that was the application of software-defined networking principles in the wide area network. And this was popularized, of course, most famously by Google, with their inter-data center design, and more recently by the likes of Microsoft, which also came up with something called SWAN, which is software-based wide area network. And these were published as recently as just a couple of years ago. Google first buzzed on the scene with this concept back in 2012 in ONS. And then just last year in a theoretical conference called ACM SIGCOMM, both Microsoft and Google gave pretty interesting presentations about their concept of software in the WAN. But then what does software-defined network, SDx, really mean for the purposes of our discussion today in the context of a carrier's network? And I think it is useful to think of SDx as a collection of software-defined or software-enabled solutions for managing and controlling data center assets, which are the network, storage, and compute we just talked about. But more importantly, also managing the service provider's WAN, which happens to include the edge, metro, and core networks as well. So you can see that this whole notion of pooling resources, which started out in the data center, and then controlling the network itself as a resource, which started out in the WAN, can come together in this notion of SDx, which we'll be talking about the rest of the day today, where we're talking about this in the context of a carrier's network, who's not just a data center provider, who's not just a network provider, who's possibly providing a mix of services, and has to think about software in that context. And as a result, SDx capabilities could be applicable to a provider's internal infrastructure, which they could be using just to make things more efficient, or it could be applicable to its customer-facing public infrastructure, which is, of course, used to offer a wide variety of services, and new services in a compelling way. So what is motivating the move to SDx? It's really the oncoming current of the cloud. So here's some numbers I pulled up from just November of this year from Cisco's annual GCI index, which gives us a sense of what's really going on in the cloud and data center world today. So the global data center traffic is expected to grow by threefold in just the next 4 years. That's a 300% growth rate. And 3/4 of all that traffic is going to come from cloud services. So it won't be the traditional data center traffic with an enterprise is talking to a data center as we've been want to thinking about so far. It's going to be enterprises with applications spread all over the cloud which are going to use data center resources. And interestingly enough, the public cloud, the private cloud, and the hybrid cloud are all going to grow at a CAGR of 40% or more over the next 4 years. In particular, the public cloud is going to reach $191 billion in business by the year 2020. And the cloud workloads are going to grow at a CAGR of about 24%. By contrast, the traditional data center workload, which is kind of one-on-one communication between an enterprise and data center, are actually going to decrease by about 2%. So as you can see, traditional data center concepts are flattening out, whereas the profusion of applications and services across the cloud and into cloud-based data centers is going up tremendously. Now, why is that important here? Is because as a carrier, this changes the nature, composition, and the dynamicity of traffic that a carrier is going to have in its infrastructure and its network. And it changes, therefore, the entire game from a carrier's perspective. And the last point is the traffic between data centers and the end users is going to reach 1.5 zettabytes annually in just the next 4 years, and that's total 17% of data center traffic. The rest of the traffic is inter-data center and intra-data center. So what does this mean really from the carrier's perspective, and what are some of the key trends that are driving this, that are impacting SDx today? Well, there are three or four trends that I'd like to point out here. One is the whole notion of these on-demand, pay-as-you-go service models. And these models are there today whether you talk about the cloud, whether you just want a piece of the cloud, or whether you want to actually get a data center, which is infrastructure as a service, or whether you actually want the entire network. So if you just want interconnectivity, even that ideally should be available on an on-demand basis, which has recently been coined under the concept of network as a service, most famously by Nanchen of the Metro Ethernet Forum, which they just did in the Gen 14 conference back in DC just last month, almost exactly a month back. And there was a big talk about that. And the other is the prominence of the software-defined data center, which we've already talked about, where the notion is that you have flexible pools of resources that can be dynamically partitioned and given away to meet the needs of specific applications. And finally, there is this notion of the emergence of the elastic cloud, where the cloud capacity can expand and contract as needed. And this was made famous by something called the pets versus the cattle paradigm, where you view your servers not as pets, to be loved and nurtured and brought up when they die, but rather as cattle, which are a dime a dozen, and once somebody dies or is ineffective, boom, you shoot it, and you bring up a new server. So that's the pets versus cattle paradigm. And what this really does is, it fundamentally impacts the way we architect the entire data center and the networks around it. And it changes our notions of availability and resilience, because now you don't think about 5 nines availability at the infrastructure level, you think about 5 nines at the application level. And you can provide that by giving a lot of redundancy at the server level, even though each individual server is not a 5-9 redundant device. And it changes, therefore, our whole notion of scaling. Instead of building bigger and better boxes, you just build more, you just add more servers to your pool of servers, and you get capacity that way. And you add more storage to your pool of storage, you get memory that way. So the entire notion of how we think about network design changes, and therefore, of course, pricing changes as well. So now, the question is, why would carriers want to adopt SDx-based solutions? What are some of the trends that are driving carriers to do that? And there are really 3 or 4 trends that are sort of inevitable and happening in the world today. Let's look at them. So the first is, as we kind of all come to know by now, is the notion of moving from hardware-centric to software-centric networks. So you don't want to just be building bigger and better boxes. You're building boxes that are flexible. You're building an infrastructure that is controllable. And the only way you can really do that today is by using software capabilities. So that's an inevitability. The other is, there are a lot of software innovations happening based on open interfaces. So if you have closed proprietary boxes and closed proprietary networks, there's really no easy way for you to control them in a uniform way. To be able to do that, you must have the ability to connect with those boxes and those devices. And the only way you can do that is if you have open interfaces and open APIs to expose the capabilities of those devices. And fortunately or unfortunately, there is an increasing complexity of the operator back office, which is often the hidden elephant in the room. The management systems, the network management, the operation support systems, the billing systems, these are all still tied to the old way of building networks. And if you start changing the front network architecture, whether it's at the data center or at the network level, the WAN level, you'll soon hit the complexity of the back office because that's not evolving fast enough. So that's another trend that's going to change the way carriers approach SDx. They're going to have to deal with this complexity and transform that. And finally, it's the advent of open source solutions. It's the day of open source today. A lot of things are available in open source, which makes for very fast development cycles, very fast deployment cycles. But the most important thing here is that the back office transformation is really key to the migration to SDx. In fact, in order to scale the carrier's operations, the back office network management systems must evolve and must change. And if they don't, then it's very difficult for us to adopt things like SDN or NFV, which are all effectively software and programmable in nature. If your back office is not programmable, is not coupled to the software, it's really very difficult to make that evolution. So, given that these are the trends that are driving the carrier to adopting software-based solutions, what are the challenges? And of course, you're going to hear about that throughout the day today in various panels and various discussions. But let me quickly talk about what I have found based on my sort of research to be some of the key challenges that carriers face today. So the first is that carriers have to realize that the challenge is in their business and not just in new technology. So it is the business that has to transform. So and that comes from the need to improve revenues and to control costs. And that's going to force a change in business operational processes. So that's like the first step. Okay? But changing business is a lot harder than adopting technology. So clearly that's one of the big challenges that carriers are going to be facing for some time to come. The other is that, as I just mentioned before, they need to modernize their service operations and management before deploying SDx solutions. That's kind of a prerequisite, or at least at the very minimum, it's got to go hand in hand. Because otherwise, if you cannot manage the new software-defined infrastructure well, you really cannot exploit its capabilities, you cannot benefit from its qualities. Okay? And the entire paradigm of how networks are managed is changing. So there's a need to, because increasingly network technologies are using IT-based principles and IT-based stacks. We're using servers, we're using software, we're using network-based storage. What does that mean? You're adopting IT-like behavior. And what that means is that the carrier's network operations teams and their IT teams have to cooperate together. This most famously has been coined as the third way by British Telecom, and there's a lot of things on the web you can find in interviews and such where they've talked about this. And this is a challenge because A, traditionally these teams have not worked together. B, they have a completely different philosophy as to how the network works. The network ops team is 18-month design cycles, test everything out, big boxes, high reliability. And as I told earlier, the IT team is quick DevOps, let's deploy, let's manage, let's see, get the feedback and make changes very, very quickly because they're using open source, they're using open interfaces, all of which, make things move faster. And they're also not in the mode of, testing things for 18 months before deploying it. Nor are they, deploying servers that have 5 nines reliability. So the entire philosophies are different. But today those two groups need to come together and they need to cooperate. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy transformation to make from a carrier's perspective. And then, interoperability. The software-defined solutions, as you see, have a number of moving parts and pieces. And the biggest challenge for a carrier in deploying that is the ability to get things interoperable. And there we have a constant race between, can we standardize fast enough, vis-a-vis can we make innovations fast enough and get things deployed fast enough. So there we have, interoperability, which keeps coming up. And finally, which we said earlier, is a carrier has to resolve service silos. So you can no longer have a voice network and a data network. You cannot have a wireless operations crew and a wireline operations crew. You cannot have people that are looking at the transport and just people looking at the packet. You got to resolve those silos because the services are all running on common infrastructure today. They have to be managed in a common way using software as the basis to do that. And so the silos have to be resolved. And if we are in fact going to deploy software-based solutions, they have to extend seamlessly across the carrier infrastructure and the IT infrastructure of the enterprise that the carrier is actually providing service to. They have to seamlessly work across them. For A, the carrier to get benefit out of it, for the enterprise to get benefit out of it, and for both of them to get a cost advantage from that deployment. And that must happen across both public networks or private networks, quite obviously, because the kind of network doesn't really impact that. So as carriers overcome this challenge, these kind of challenges, they're going to move closer to an SDx vision, and this is what we'll actually be exploring throughout the day today. So let me very quickly give you a sense of what's coming up. So right after this presentation, we'll be having a panel that's going to talk about evolving towards the software-enabled age, and all of the issues that I've been mentioning, we're going to sort of examine that at a closer level of granularity. Then we have three different parts of the day today. One is SDx case study that happens from 11 to 12:45, where we talk about network virtualization in the cloud, which is a panel that's going to be moderated by Eric Schneider, my colleague from Quant Funds. And then Sanjay Nayak, SVP from PACnet, will talk about SDN in the data center and the WAN, coming from an operator's perspective. And finally, we'll talk about the commercial opportunities posed by SDx, which is another panel discussion with Jeff Finkelstein of Cox and again Sanjay Nayak of PACnet. And in the afternoon, we have a session on challenges of SDx, 2 to 3:15, where the first part we'll talk about software-defined data centers, software-defined storage, the issues of security and compliance, and what does the enterprise do for disaster recovery or business continuity. And that's an interesting panel that's going to be headed by Craig Matsumoto of SDN Central. And then we have a very interesting presentation on the investment potential of SDx from Infonetics. And finally, at 4 to 5, we have the think tank session where we'll be in this room sitting on the tables and talking about 3 or 4 key issues for the evolution of SDx, where in each table we'll kind of debate it, and at the end of the day, we're going to discuss our findings or our conclusions with the rest of the room. So that's what we have coming up for you. I hope you have a fantastic SDx session, and I thank you very much for being here, and look forward to talking to you all throughout the day.